Good afternoon, everyone. While we're waiting for the others, I'd like for everyone to mute yourselves, please. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes while we're waiting for other attendees. Continue, please. Continue the music. We'll start at, what time is it? 2:03. Okay, I think we can start now. Welcome to all the attendees. We are expecting around 200 participants or registrants from 49 countries to the third webinar on GeneDrive for 2022. And it's now entitled Integrating Social, Economic, and Health Aspects in the Decision-Making Process. On behalf of the Outreach Network for GeneDrive Research and the International Service for the Acquisition of Agri-Biotech Applications Incorporated, I, Dr. Dora Romero Aldemita, the Executive Director of ISA Inc., welcome you to this webinar number 3. The webinar is hosted by ISA Inc., based in the Philippines. We gratefully acknowledge our network of biotech information centers in Asia. I see their names here in the registration, and partners in Oceania for their support in this activity. We have two experts today who will respond to key questions on GeneDrive. The first one is, what is the role of socioeconomic impact assessment? How do they complement environmental risk assessment? And the second one is, how do we assess GeneDrive's potential social, economic, and health aspects? These are informations that are important as we prepare our regulators in the upcoming Convention on Biological Diversity in Quebec, in Montreal, Quebec. The webinar will run for 1.5 hours, hopefully, but with enthusiastic attendees, we can expect more than 1 hour and a half. We are currently on live stream at ISA Inc.'s Facebook account and YouTube channels. All microphones are on mute, and questions should be entered in the Q&A function only. The chat function will be used by the panelists and for important messages to the participants. Let us now post, can we have the house rules, please? So the chat functions will be used by the panelists and for important messages to the participants. All of the presentations and the Zoom recordings will be posted at the ISA Inc. website and are freely downloadable. You can have the previous webinars, 1, 2, and 3, 1 and 2 this year, and 4 webinars of last year's. We also invite you to stay till the end of the webinar and respond to a post-webinar survey, and respondents will be given certificates. So I hope I don't see questions on, can we see the PowerPoint slides or can we have the certificates, please? So I tell you that the PowerPoint slides will be downloadable at the ISA website, including the Zoom recordings, and that the post-webinar survey, which you will respond at the end of the webinar, will be your key to the certificates. Okay, so let's now start. Let me now introduce our able moderator for this webinar. Dr. Mary Grace Dacuma is currently an assistant professor at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. Her research involved epidemiology, diagnostics, transmission, and drug resistance of malaria parasites, and was recently involved in the development of dengue infection modeling tool for START Network Philippines. She is a molecular epidemiologist who holds a PhD in infectious and tropical diseases from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, University of London, United Kingdom, where she also conducted her postdoctoral research on novel nucleic acid surveillance for malaria elimination. She holds a Master's of Science in Molecular Biology and Biotechnology from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, and a bachelor's degree in biology from the Mindanao State University, General Santos City, as magna cum laude. Colleagues and friends, let's welcome Dr. Mary Grace Dacuma. Grace, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Aldamita, for that very warm introduction. And I thank you all for joining us today for the third and final webinar of the 2022 GeneDrive webinar series, which is organized by the International Service for Acquisitions of Agri-Biotechnology Applications in partnership with the Outreach Network for GeneDrive Research. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce today's distinguished speakers. Firstly, we have Dr. Ravi Srinivas, who is a senior fellow and consultant with Research and Information System for Developing Countries. This is actually a policy research think tank based in New Delhi. He edits the Asian Biotechnology and Development Review, which is an international peer-reviewed open access publication indexed in inter alia Scopus. He also researches on science, technology, and innovation issues, including biotechnology and biodiversity. Now, our second speaker is Ms. Delphine Tizzi, who is a stakeholder engagement senior advisor of Target Malaria. She has over 10 years experience in the field of stakeholder engagement in lower income countries with a particular focus on conflict drivers. She worked for several years as Target Malaria Engagement Manager, helping teams in Mali, Uganda, Burkina Faso, and Ghana to co-develop an engagement strategy for the GeneDrive-based vector control technology in development. Now, before we start our discussions, I would like to invite everyone, every attendee here, to respond to our poll for the day. Let's see if you are following the GeneDrive debate. May I request posting the question on the screen, please? So, according to the International Association of Impact Assessment, we can conceptualize social impacts as changes in A, shared beliefs and values, B, personal and property rights, C, political systems, D, health and well-being, or E, all of the above. So, pick your choice. The poll is actually posted on your screen. Let's see. Oh, it appears that many of you, actually 83% of you, picked all of the above, all of the choices above. The changes in all of the above to conceptualize as social impacts. Now, I believe Dr. Ravi's presentation will help us to answer the question, right, Dr. Srinivas? So please take the floor, sir.
Thank you. Good morning to all. Good morning to the organizers, and thank them for giving me this opportunity. My presentation will be on socioeconomic impact and then GeneDrives, and then how it differs from environmental assessment. Can you please share this slide on the screen? Hello, please share this here. Basically, the idea here is how do we look at socioeconomic impact assessment and then environmental assessment and then gene drives. Next slide, please. The Cartagena Protocol talks about the socioeconomic considerations. According to Article 26.1, the parties in their decision to import under this domestic measures implementing, they can take up socioeconomic considerations arising from the impact of living modified organisms on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, especially with regard to the value of biological diversity and indigenous local communities. Although the article talks about impact on biological diversity, the idea can be extended for a broader socioeconomic impact analysis. Next slide, please. Traditional cost-benefit analysis takes into account cost and benefits in terms of finance or economic cost and benefits, but not social gains and cost. On the other hand, socioeconomic impact assessment supplements and complements this traditional cost-benefit analysis, but there is no consensus on what all should be considered under this. So the SCIA can aid in decision-making, particularly in addressing societal concerns, including health, gender, and employment impacts. Now, countries have interpreted and incorporated SCA in different ways, in different approaches. SCA can be done prior to authorization to cultivate GMOs, post-approval marketing, and to study the long-term impacts. Next slide, please. In socioeconomic consideration, social impact analysis, there are a lot of dimensions. For example, we can take these as the broader dimensions. Social dimensions would mean social acceptability, social utility, how it changes the land use, how it changes the community's rights, then food sovereignty, food security, gender impacts, farmers' rights, IPR and patents, livelihood of the community, system development. Then comes economic dimensions, access and cost of technology, changes in the agricultural production system, changes in the productivity, changes for small and marginal farmers, change in export trends, change in economic value of the traditional varieties, change in industrial trends, markets, the loss of crops, employment loss or gain, impact on small and business development, impact on urban agriculture. Like we can also take into account the cultural, ethical, and religious dimension, including values and norms, particularly cultural aspects and practices, ethical and moral concerns, impact on traditional crops and products, religious concerns, traceability and labeling issues. When it comes to ecological dimension, there's question of loss of genetic diversity, agrobiodiversity loss, farmers' varieties loss, development of weed resistance, changes in energy pattern, changes in herbicide use, changes in insecticide use, greenhouse gas emissions, soil contamination, and then impact environment. When it comes to health, we can take both the direct health impacts as well as indirect health impact like food safety, nutritional needs, public health impact. Next slide, please. Now, many countries have actually tried to adopt this SCA in different ways. We have prepared a table here. The details will be available in the book which I'm showing you. If you look at it, in Africa, many countries have done. America and Caribbean also many countries have taken into account. Asia Pacific, Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia, New Zealand, Philippines, Republic of Korea have done. In Europe also many countries have done. Although Europe, cultivation of GMOs is not practically done anywhere. Next slide, please. Similarly, again in Americas and Caribbeans, Mexico, Panama, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela have done. A lot of countries have implemented them through various direct regulations or through acts or through guidelines. But the question here is that how they have been able to do it. Countries have approached it in very different way. For example, in Argentina, it is considered a socioeconomic impact analysis only when they take into account whether that will affect the export-import of that particular crop. In some countries, it is not mandatory, it's an option which the government can direct the authorities to do. Whereas in some countries, particularly in the Europe, like Norway, they have a very stringent Gene Act which mandates that such analysis should be done as part of the very approval process itself. Next slide, please. So there is no universal methodology. There are countries have used different parameters. So SCA can be part of a comprehensive assessment which includes environmental risk assessment, cost-benefit analysis. It can complement both. But the problem is here is that to do this SCA, you need capacity and also long-term impact will have to be studied, which means that you need to have infrastructure, you need to have a setup, and then other things to do. So there have been a lot of discussions about the SCIA in the conventional biological diversity. There is an ad hoc technical experts group which has submitted its report. You could locate it and then download it in the CBD website itself. But how do we implement it? What are the methodology and guidelines? And then how do we really try to practically put this in terms of specific methodologies and guidelines rather than talking in terms of very vague terms? So RIS, in association with research institutes, did case studies and developed a methodology and guidelines as a part of UNEP Jeff funded project, which we did through the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Government of India. Next slide, please. So these guidelines, these case studies have been published in this book, Socioeconomic Impact Analysis of Genetically Modified Crops. This is Springer publication. Unfortunately, it's a prize publication, but we can find some of our inputs and then analysis in the RIS website. I've given the link in the end. From there, you can download a lot of material which is very relevant to this. Next slide, please. So how do we differentiate between SCIA and ERA? Environmental risk assessment has got a very sharp focus on environmental risk only. It doesn't take into account the socioeconomic impact analysis or the traditional economic analysis. Whereas SCIA is much more broader. It can incorporate EA also, but can incorporate values and norms. For example, a GMO may be culturally insensitive if the outcome of a genetic modification of a plant considered sacred or used in religious rituals. Whereas the traditional ERA will not be able to take into account these things. And SCIA has got a health impact dimension, and findings from ERA can be used to validate or disprove the health impact. For example, if the ERA takes into account the impact of pesticides or herbicides or the toxic chemicals in the environment, this can be directly linked with the health impact assessment. And then the causal relationship and then the causation can be identified and then can be studied. But at the same time, if the health impact is not very much or the health impact is minimal, and this can be disproved by ERA, which can specifically look into the ecosystem damage, environmental system damage from the on account of using of these herbicides, insecticides, and then toxic chemicals. So SCIA and ERA need not always concur on the findings. They can be used to validate each other or to disprove each other impact. But then always you would need a larger analysis and the larger studies to validate whether in case of any discrepancy. So SCIA and ERA should ideally be done on a long-term basis than as one-time exercise. Next slide, please. Coming to gene drives, SCIA, gene drives have similarities with GMOs and GM crops, but not identical. And gene drives also will have long-term impacts. Hence, both SCIA and ERA are necessary for it. The methodology we have developed can be suitably modified, and this, depending upon the context, health aspect may be more important, particularly in gene drives. Technically, gene drives are covered by the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. Hence, SCIA can be done under Article 26.1. But we have not come across any such assessment. And SCIA for gene drive should pay attention for more long-term ecological consequences and their impacts than for GM crops. So this aspect will have to be understood. In the volume which we have shown, that's a chapter which looks into SCIA for emerging technologies, including synthetic biology and gene drives. We have discussed how SCIA for gene drives can be done and how it can be done under the Cartagena Protocols, Article 26.1, and then what are the broad methodologies for it. Next slide, please. So there are merits and limitations in doing an SCIA. It is legally acceptable in international law because besides CPB, there are other environmental agreements which mention about SCIA. And then as it is done under Article 26.1, which comprehensive, complements ERA and CBA. Many countries have implemented it, hence with different approaches and guidelines. Hence, there are many guidelines and precedents which can be suitably taken up or modified or tweaked according to the needs. It enhances credibility and provides for public participation in decision making, as surveys will reflect public views and preferences. This is very important because whether it is gene drives or any other emerging technology, public engagement is going to be a crucial thing in both understanding the impact as well as public acceptance. And this is all the more well suited to consider norms, values which cannot be assessed through CBA or ERA. Next slide, please. But then there are some real issues. There is no agreed methodology or guidelines. Again, you need to have capacity and to have measures to many aspects is not going to be easy. But the question is, different stakeholders have different priorities, and doing SEA will get more information needed, but that need not result in any clarity, because in any technology, the stakeholders' interest will be different. For example, in GM crops, the business which wants to promote GM crops will have a different interest, whereas environmentalists who feel that GM crops are not environmentally beneficial will have different interests. So there will be conflict of interest, and then SEIA will give you a lot of inputs, it can synthesize the views, but it need not result in clarity per se. That the decision makers will have to take the understanding the various results, and then trying to strike a balance, and then trying to take into account different views, and then see which should get a preference, and then how do we mitigate the negative impacts on that. Doing it in the long term involves the investment infrastructure, whether there should be supplementary or main tool for assessment again is a matter of dispute. Still, SEA is an important tool in assessment, and it is all the more relevant for gene drives. Only thing is that we have to really do a lot of work in how do we make it workable for gene drives, particularly not just for GM mosquitoes, but also for gene drives application in agriculture and in other sectors. Next slide, please. Actually, RIS has published a lot of materials on that, including a special issue of ABDR on socioeconomic considerations under CBD. So all I would suggest is that please visit our website. We'll be able to locate them and download them. Thanks for your attention. I'm ready to welcome questions and then answer them. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ravi, for a very comprehensive presentation. We will entertain your questions after the second speaker. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Delphine Daisy to speak about the potential social, economic, and health impacts of gene drives. What is the impact of this gene drive research can have? Delphine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizer for having me. Let me get started. So I thought I would just start by being a bit provocative, and I've been asked to say, okay, how do we assess gene drive social, health, and economic impacts? And I want to say I think we need to reformulate this question, because otherwise it would be an impossible task. And the reason for that is that I think we can assess a specific gene drive organism, but not gene drive. The gene drive organism are very diverse. The research ongoing is going in very different directions, and therefore any assessment would have to be case by case. And I think that if there was one message I think the audience should remember is that one. Why is that? Is you can have gene drive organism for different purposes. For example, you might want to reduce the population of the target species, or you might want to alter this target population, for example, to make it more resilient to climate change, or to make it unable to transmit a disease. You also have very different molecular systems that will have different characteristics. You, for example, can talk about gene drive that require a low threshold, meaning you require to release very few, or gene drive that require really high threshold where you'd release much more. And so depending on this, of course, the impacts could vary. You have different contexts, whether you do, you release this gene drive in Africa, in Asia, and within the countries even would have a lot of difference. If you're on indigenous land, would be very different as well. And then you have different protocols. What's exactly the protocol you're proposing to release this gene drive? Who's implementing it? All of these will make a very different case, and therefore a very different assessment. Therefore, the methodology to approach this has to be very case by case. It will have to look at a specific research protocol for a specific construct in a specific environment. On this basis, you will define what we call the area of impact or area of influence, meaning where this particular gene drive might have impacts, and this will be very different according to these different aspects. what those impacts could be. And I will remind here that in impact assessment methodology, contrary to the environmental risk assessment, we look at both beneficial impact, positive impact, and negative impact. Then you'll look at how you can maximize the positive impacts. And then for the negative one, and in order, you'll try to first avoid them, minimize them. And if you can't do these two things, you'll try to mitigate. And then finally, as part of impact assessment, you will define how to engage the potentially affected people. As Dr. Ravi said very well, to this date, there's been no impact assessment done for engineered gene drive. And the reason for that is that a lot of those gene drive are still in the lab for those who have even been developed. There's been no release of gene drive, and releases are still far away. So the impact assessment, the protocols are not written yet. The constructs are still under development, which is why you can't find any of those yet. So when you look at the assessment, I wanted to do a quick parallel between impact assessment and risk assessment. The impact assessments are usually part of the environmental code, and they apply to different projects. They're not specific to LMOs. So very often you'll see them for infrastructure. You'll do an impact assessment for a new road, for a new hospital, for industry. While for the risk assessment, they would be part of the biosafety processes, which is why Dr. Ravi referred to the Cartagena protocol. The impact assessment will look at both positive and negative impacts, while the risk assessment only looks at risk. The impact assessment will include environmental aspects, but also social, economic, health, and increasingly you will find that they cover human rights aspects. On the ERI side, they will focus on environmental aspects, as their name says it, although countries may take into account on a voluntary basis the social economic considerations. The impact assessment, they have a structured a process for consultation. This is well defined in international standards, and in particular in the International Finance Corporation and World Bank standards. In the EIA, there is a reference to public consultation as part of Article 23, but it's very much left to each country to define how this is done, and therefore you might find very different levels. And finally, while it's true that within the Convention on Biological Diversity, there is no standards on how to do impact assessment, outside of this, there are a lot of standards, and it's a well-codified practice in the IFC and the World Bank, but also the development banks. So what would be the consideration if you were in the future to do such impact assessment for gene drive organism? So the first very important thing, and it is part of the impact assessment methodology, is to look at this analysis in context. So before you look at the impact of a gene drive organism, you have to look at what happens in the absence of those organisms. What's the burden of the current situation? I've put here two of the burdens that are considered for potential gene drive use in the future. One is fighting invasive rodents that are endangering, in particular, birds, in particular on islands. And the other one is fighting mosquitoes that are vector of disease, including and in particular malaria, but also Aedes-borne diseases, which is maybe a bit more relevant in Asia. So you look at what's the burden. You look at what are the current tools to fight this problem and what are their own impact. The gene drive organism would not take place into a vacuum. There are already tools to fight those problems, and those tools might have impact on their own. And then how efficacious are the current tools and how acceptable are the current impacts? If the current tools were completely efficacious, you might not be looking for an alternative like gene drive. Similarly, if the current tools had no unacceptable impact, you might again look at the gene drive in a very different way. This is part of what we call alternative analysis, and it includes other intervention, and it includes the case of no intervention. Can we just stay with the status quo? Is that acceptable? Now, when you look at gene drive impacts, you will look at 3 types of impacts, and it's very important to differentiate them. The first is the impact of the organism itself. What could be the presence, the impact, sorry, if any, related to the presence of the construct on the target population? What will it change, and what will this have as an impact more broadly on the environment, on social, economic, etc. aspects? That's the pure organism, its presence. The second type of impacts are the impacts of the protocol activities. It's not just that you're releasing an organism, it's that you will have team members, you might have monitoring activities, you might need to have meetings with people, and these activities, beyond the fact that they are gene drive or other, will have an impact on people. And then finally, the impact of the outcome. If the intervention is successful, for example, you reach disease reduction, you increase resilience of species, you eradicate alien species, what is the impact of this expected outcome? So I'm taking a hypothetical one here, and I won't go into all the details, but it's just to give you a sense of what you'd look at. When you're looking at the impact, and I'm taking the hypothetical example of a gene drive mosquito that would reduce malaria burden in sub-Saharan Africa by reducing malaria vector population. The first kind of impact on gene drive of the organism itself, again, will depend on the characteristic of the construct and of the mosquito species. So I'm not going to tell you what the impacts would be, but I'm going to tell you some questions you might want to ask. You might want to ask, if you're targeting a particular species, does it have a cultural or religious importance or role for the communities? If you have any environmental impacts, which are not the topic here of this presentation, but if you have environmental impacts on other species, do these species have a cultural or religious role? Do they have an ecosystem? Do they play an ecosystem service? And so what would be the consequence on human population? Or questions about whether this new gene drive mosquito would increase human or animal allergic reaction above those of the wild type mosquito. And I think the way this question is formulated shows you that it's not happening in a vacuum. It's about, we know mosquitoes are very, bites can be very itchy. So would a gene drive mosquito bite be more allergenic or differently allergenic than the wild type? Now, the impacts of protocol activities. It will again depend on the specific activities, how you do it. For example, if you release by driving to a place, or if you release by using drones, you'll have very different impacts. The questions you might want to ask is the presence of people going to disrupt people's, the community's livelihood activities? If you're going to involve local employees, is this new income going to create positive impacts for the communities? It's going to create negative impacts. Can the presence of the local team lead to local inflation? We know inflation is a big topic these days. So could this happen because you're bringing people with higher income? And other questions that you can read here, road accidents, etc. And then impact of the outcome. For example, malaria reduction. And this might appear a bit weird because often people say, you know, the outcome, for instance, with disease reduction is so good, we shouldn't even look at the impacts. But impact assessment would look at that, and it's questions that people might raise. Again, it will depend on the magnitude of the impact. Are you completely eradicating the disease, or are you having a temporary reduction? This will impact how much the magnitude of your impact. But the questions you could ask would be around: could the malaria reduction lead to population influx, for instance? Could the fact that it saves life have an impact on environmental resources use? Could have an impact on access to education, to health system? Could it have an impact on women empowerment? So a lot of this question would be what you would start asking in those hypothetical impact assessment for gene drive. Now, what is the project I represent doing and looking when looking at those assessments? So in some of the countries where target malaria operates, there is a requirement for some of these studies before you do a release. And I want to stress that at this point, the project is very far from considering gene drive releases. So I'm going to talk about other genetically modified mosquitoes that are not gene drive. They are Mendelian inheritance, but nonetheless, they are GMOs. And that, and which regulation that includes, which might tell us a little bit what in the future could be regulations for gene drive. So in Burkina, they require two types of assessment. One is an environmental risk assessment. It's part of biosafety regulation. It's done by a biosafety agency. It's reviewed, by a biosafety agency. It's under Ministry of Higher Education and Research, and it leads to a decision to grant or not a release permit, without which you cannot release any modified mosquitoes. They also require an impact assessment. It's under the environmental regulation, and it's reviewed by the National Agency for Environmental Evaluations. It's under the Ministry of Environment, and it leads to a favorable or not favorable opinion to proceed to release. And these two processes are in parallel. The project is is commissioning at the moment environmental, social, economic, health impact assessment, ISHA for short, for its intermediary step, the release of a non-gene drive, genetically modified male bias mosquito strain. Again, it's not a gene drive one, but it nonetheless is a modified mosquito. There's no clear precedent in this field, in the field of GMOs, or in the field of using mosquitoes for control in terms of impact assessment implementation. However, there's a lot of precedents from other fields that can be learned from. And so this process starts with a scoping phase where you identify what are the key issues, which is the phase that is about to start for this research. And in the case of target malaria, the impact assessment is also linked to the community agreement model, because the agreement model is based on who is impacted, and the impact assessment identifies who is impacted and therefore who will have to give their decision. The other thing Target Malaria does and is planning at the moment is what we call a strategic environmental assessment. Now, this is a bit less common, and it's a high-level strategic framework tool. It helps you to think early about the development of a policy, of a plan, of a program, and helps you start thinking of some of these environmental, social, economic, health implications before you have a specific construct in mind, before you have a particular protocol or even a specific context. So it's kind of a step before that allows you to have this strategic view before you get those details. And so here it's showing you a bit all these different levels of how you would get this done. And so that's it for me. I think I'm probably over time, and I'm just going to stop here. This is the people who are funding our research, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Open Philanthropy. Sorry if I've exceeded my time.
Thanks a lot, Delphine, for a very comprehensive presentation. Both you and Dr. Ravi actually gave us a lot to think about. It is indeed crucial to understand the potential social, economic, and health impacts of gene drives, as well as its potential risk, to make an informed decision on whether to develop and apply gene drive tools. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for a question and answer session. I would like to invite everyone to use the Q&A box to send your questions if you haven't done it yet. So feel free, don't be shy. Put your questions on the Q&A box. But okay, I have a question here first for Dr. Ravi. Dr. Ravi, in your opinion, must there be a uniform way for all countries to interpret and incorporate socio-economic impact assessment in the use of gene drive tools, and why?
Yes, there is good scope. See, the only hurdle now is that gene drives are not yet fully operationalized in many countries. So our experience from the field is very limited. But then SEA can also take into account both ex-ante studies in the sense that you can do a broader SEA where you can anticipate some developments in the future, and then you can also look into what could be the potential adverse impacts, positive impacts, and all. So SEA is flexible enough to look into that, even if the technology is fully, developed or advanced or not yet implemented. But the only constraint is that there should be political will to do an SEA and engage with all the stakeholders. The second constraint is that, again, gene drives, there are different types and for different purposes. To what extent you want to use which application in which context also is important. In fact, as it was pointed out, you should also look into what are the other technological alternatives available. So in which case you have to do first a technology assessment among the available technological options, and then try to see whether you can do a SEA for gene drives if you choose that to be the best option. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi, for a very comprehensive answer. Now, I have a question here from the audience, directed for Delphine. This is from Grace Glenn Gabisay. She said, on the malaria topic, there was a movie that used a modified locust that is carnivorous and it attacked people with settings in the US. Oh dear. How risk can go in terms of biological aspects of gene-drive insects that have fast locomotion and are very difficult to recall. So remember, we released them in the wild.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you, Grace. Well, first, I always find it very interesting how fiction, in particular movie, shapes the way that we look at new technologies. And so I think we have, as an engagement person, we have to look at that and take that into account, that a lot of the concerns, a lot of the hopes are often shaped by how fiction describes new technologies. So I think in terms, I can't comment on the movie. Unfortunately, I haven't seen it. It does sound a pretty scary movie. But it is, again, back to risk assessment and to an impact assessment. So you'd have to look at the actual case. So I would imagine in that case, if I'm making it hypothetical, there might not have been a very rigorous risk assessment done on this locust in the movie, because a risk assessment would have looked at what are the feeding behavior of this locust, what are the risks that this locust could have. Could they eat people, for example, if I take the example of the movie? And it would look at the different mitigation measures. Can we avoid it? Can we mitigate it? And therefore, it might have concluded that this particular locust shouldn't be released. So in the case of gene-drive insects, we know that for each case, as I mentioned, depending on the construct, depending on the characteristic, the context, it will have to be assessed what could go wrong, what could go well, and as Dr. Ravi just said, what are the alternatives and what's the relative impacts of those alternatives. I hope I responded to the question.
You actually did. Now that enticed me to really watch that movie. So Dr. Ola actually posted here a question for Dr. Ravi. This is from Zaira. Dr. Ravi, what is the role of local communities in those assessments? And risk perception can vary from one stakeholder to another. So how their concerns are integrated in the process?
See, there are many ways of doing this SEA. One is that you engage with the stakeholders through questionnaires, surveys of their values, their opinions, and other things. Other thing is that as there are different stakeholders with different priorities and different interests, SEA will try to integrate all their views, and then SEA will say, okay, fine. If someone has got a specific concern, how do you address it? And then that is a thing which SEA can help. For example, if many stakeholders feel that GM crops or even gene drives are good, but then they are not convinced about the real benefits, or they feel that they are also commensurate with environmental risks, then SEA will tell that you need to address that concern either by doing a comprehensive environmental risk assessment, or at least you need to educate people as to what could be the potential benefits as well as risks, because sometimes people tend to underestimate their risks and overestimate the benefits and vice versa. So you have to have both public engagement, communication as one hand, as well as doing a lot of risk assessments, other studies to really come to conclusion. What happens if there are a lot of conflicting views and then multiple views? For example, you take GM crops, there are multiple views on whether patent should be allowed or not. Again, what should be done for farmers who will be affected? SEA will give you the parameters or how much the farmers are willing to pay for, and then what are their real concerns. Depending upon that, the decision will have to be taken. Suppose if the farmers feel that the GM crops are really good, but then they feel that patents will increase the price beyond their reach, then that issue has to be addressed through licensing, royalty payments, and then making seeds available at affordable rates. On the other hand, if the feeling is that the GM crops may not be so good even after paying so much, then there's a problem with the technology and with the perception. So both need to be addressed. So SEA will give you a lot of insights, will give you a lot of understanding as to what the stakeholders view. But how do we go about dealing with them is totally a question that is more a question of political will, and then how the government wants to take a call on that technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ravi. Now, I have here a question to Delphine from Manav Sharma. Could you please give a view how you interact with community for risk impact analysis? And is there any role from community during assessment and risk communication?
It's a very good question. So I will differentiate the two because the approach is quite different. So in impact assessments, it is actually codified. There is an obligation to engage the communities for the groups, and usually it's independent assessors that do that. It's not the projects or the proponent itself, and there are particular steps, and those steps might be established in the regulation. And in any case, they are established in best practices and in the World Bank standard, for example. And those steps would include, for example, before you start an impact assessment, you have to do information session for all the community and the people, stakeholders living in the area of influence. That will be the first part. Then they will be consulted to understand what we call the baseline. So how is the environment, the context before the organism or before the project takes place, and then depending how much the project wants to push that, but you can have very participatory methods. So you can will include communities in your impact assessment, in how you design your mitigation measures. And at the end, again, it's quite codified that you have to consult people about the impacts and the mitigation measures. That's the part that the study does, the impact assessment itself. In most regulation, and it, for example, is the case in Burkina Faso, once the impact assessment is done, the regulator, the agency, does its own consultation. And so there's a time, it's called public inquiry. The final impact assessment is made public. And then there's a process that the regulator does to gather comments. It's not a question of giving approval or not. It's gathering whether whether any impacts were missed, whether there's issue with the methodology, etc. So I think that's on the impact assessment. On the risk assessment side, there is a call in the Cartagena Protocol for participation in the decision-making. It's not very stringent, and countries have done it in different ways. So in some cases, you might have a consultation. That's the case in Burkina Faso, where there was a consultation after the EI, the environmental risk assessment, was done. The regulator actually had their own consultation in those communities. It's not always the case, and there have been questions about that. And there's actually a whole emerging theme in academia about how to involve better non-specialists or non-experts or different experts, non-environmental experts into environmental risk assessments. So more academic resources coming up on that, as we know a few people working on it.
Thank you so much, Delphine. Now, I have here a question. Actually, this can be for Dr. Ravi, and Delphine, you can actually jump in after him. This is from Nang Huan Hue. So, do we need a new regulatory framework to ensure gene drives are safe? Dr. Ravi?
Ideally speaking, each technology should have its own regulation. For example, GM crops, they would need one. And then for non-GM crops, they would need one. So for gene drives, better to have a specific legislation-backed regulation for gene drives for two purposes. One, it will ensure that the specificities of risks and benefits of that technology are ideally regulated. Two, it will also inspire confidence among all the stakeholders that, okay, this is what you have to do if you have to develop an application in gene drive. What is the regulatory process, whom we should approach, how we should go about it, how we should test it, and then what are the protocols to be followed, whether you are going to import the gene drives and then test, or whether you're going to export them, or are you going to develop them on their own and then do some field tests. So ideal situation will be, you should have a regulation specifically meant for gene drives. But such a regulation can also derive its fundamental principles from other regulations, such as the ones which are applicable for environmental issues, and then particularly some principles like precautionary principle can be used in regulation of emerging technology like gene drive. So the ideal solution will be that, but countries may not always have such a capacity or the legal frameworks to do that. So best way in that case is that you take up something which is currently in vogue, modify it suitably for gene drive so that the technology just gets started. And then as it goes, try to develop that into a full-fledged regulation, then trying to come up with a full-fledged regulation at the beginning itself. So they can take up some aspects from the environmental impact assessment, environmental regulations, and particularly the regulations concerning biodiversity, and then say wetlands or specific ecosystems, and then develop guidelines. Okay, this is the way you should do environmental assessment. This is the way this technology should be tested. This is the way its health impact should be assessed, and then develop a full-fledged one. So both options are possible. You begin with a whole framework and then try to implement it, or you go incrementally, begin with something, and then over a period of incremental regulation, you increase it, and then you expand the scope so that after a few years or so, it becomes complete.
And yeah, I agree. So there are already regulation. The Convention on Biological Diversity has confirmed that gene drive are in fact living modified organism or genetically modified organism, depending which language we use. And therefore they fall under the Cartagena Protocol that regulates those organisms and requires an environmental risk assessment. Now, there are discussions at the CBD, but also in other regions about, as Dr. Ravi just said, what specific guidelines might be needed. So a lot of the discussion, and for example, here in Europe, EFSA has been looking at that. The discussion was, are the guidelines that we have, is the framework that we have for LMO sufficient, or are there differences that require specific guidelines? And the conclusion, at least at EFSA level, because the CBD is still negotiating, the conclusion at EFSA was they're overall adequate, but there are some particular aspects that would deserve specific guidelines, and those aspects might be about the persistence of the organism in the environment. And the CBD this December, hopefully, if everything goes well, in Montreal, we'll be discussing the similar thing, whether additional voluntary guidelines for gene drive would be helpful, and if so, what exactly should they focus on, and what the process should be. But as Dr. Ravi said, there's also other guidelines or other regulation that exist on environmental code, which regulates impact assessment, for instance, that might be very helpful. There are also regional initiatives, for example, the African Union is currently working on a West African guidelines for vector control using genetic approaches, which should address some of these issues. So there's a lot of work. It's not a vacuum. There's quite a lot happening already. And it's important that we keep looking at what might be helpful for risk assessors in terms of support.
Thank you, Delphine and Dr. Ravi. Now I have here another question for you, Delphine. How different should be the impact assessment for gene-drive mosquitoes compared to other stages of the research?
How different compared to other stages of the research? Oh, I'm not completely sure to understand the question. I think, so I hope I'm understanding the question as in maybe what's the challenges of that impact assessment compared to impact assessment of other stage, for instance, non-gene drive modified mosquitoes. And I think that will have to do with the question of the area of influence, area of impact. For gene drive organism, again, there's not a gene drive in general. If we take the idea of a gene drive organism that is meant to be self-sustaining and to spread in a wide population, for example, for malaria control, that's what you would need. If we take that particular case, I think one of the challenge will be the area of influence, how broad that is, and how you approach this with different countries, because you would probably be of a different jurisdiction, or you might have a need for this more regional coordination. And I think that is why for example, the African Union is looking at this West African, so a much broader region approach to see how particularly this will be addressed. And I think it's a bit the similar difference with the risk assessment. Like the tools are the same, but the question is the scope. How scope about time and scope about space.
Thank you, Delphine. Now I have a question here for Dr. Ravi. This is from Muhammad Ahmed Hafiz. When considering the ecological impacts of gene drive, do we need to consider any potential or non-potential factor that could occur in the future and risk the ecological stability? Dr. Ravi?
Fundamentally, the issue here is that this is a major concern or major people fear. What they fear about gene drives is what will be the long-term consequences. Yes, there is a long-term consequences or potential possibility is there, but again, it depends upon what sort of application you are trying to envisage and what sort of application you are going to use. Suppose the idea is for a very limited purpose, and then the idea is that whether you use GM mosquitoes or the other type of gene drive organisms, they will have only limited time impact, then it is fine. But question is that often, in ecosystems, particularly in larger ecosystems, there's always an unpredictableness, in the sense that what exactly will happen after few cycles or after few seasons is not easy to predict. Even if you have very good, mathematical calculations and models, it becomes problematic. On the other hand, the question is that how long-term should be long-term? Long-term means, should it be, say, 5 years, or should we say 10 years, or for eternity? Now, even otherwise, ecosystems undergo changes. They get transformed either incrementally or drastically over a period of time, particularly depending upon so many other factors, which may have nothing to do with technology such as climate change and other factors. So there is a concern, this has to be done, but again, there need to be caution. In the sense that in the name of long-term impact assessment or long-term impact concerns and fears, we should not try to abandon a promising technology, or we should not try to say that since long-term consequences will never be known, this technology should not be given an opportunity to try. Rather, we should say we can take a very precautionary approach. One better way to do is that instead of testing it in very large ecosystems, do very limited, trials in some selected spots or in selected simulations, and then see how best you can come up with it. For example, instead of taking a large, aquatic ecosystem, we can try that with a smaller ecosystem, which are very similar in terms of species diversity and other ecosystem parameters, and then try to extrapolate rather than simply saying that since we may not know anything concrete or we may not be able to exactly predict, let us not try to do anything. So they have to find a way out. Here, principles like precautionary principles will be helpful in understanding like what we will know, what we may not be able to know, and how do we address the knowns, the unknowns, the unknown unknowns. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi. Now, I have a question here for Delphine. I think this is from the Philippines. This question is from the Philippines, although the name is not posted. Maybe I think a graduate student. Hello, good afternoon. What other technologies might enable us to build gene drives to alter different species? Thank you.
Thank you. And I will go as far as I can go, because I should say I'm a political scientist by training and not a molecular biologist. So maybe others might jump in. So there are different methods to build a gene drive. Gene drive is only an altered inheritance rate, but that's pretty much the definition of it. So you can use many different platforms to do that. One of the common way that's being used and has shown a lot of promises is using CRISPR. It doesn't mean that gene drive can only be done through CRISPR, but it has been showed as so far as the most efficient. So, for example, our team at Target Malaria has been working on this since 2005, so quite a while, and way before CRISPR was discovered. And so in the early days, we used different ways to cut the DNA and to engineer it. But when CRISPR came through, the team realized that it was much more efficient and much faster. And actually that really accelerated our ability to make discovery and to have something that works in the lab. So I think that is one way. I won't be able to go much further. As I say, I'm not a molecular biologist, but I'm sure some people might be able to share some references.
Thank you, Delphine. I would recommend for this anonymous attendee to actually watch the first webinar series. I think one of the speakers actually discussed the different types of gene drive there. I have another question here. This is for Dr. Ravi. During the development phase of the gene drive organism, what regulatory process that ensures they are safe?
You're on mute, Dr. Ravi.
No, I didn't get your question.
And you can actually jump in later, Delphine.
I think he didn't understand the question.
Oh, sorry.
The question is regulation during the development process.
Of the development process of the gene drive before it's released.
The regulations can always be something like, you do it for the GM crops. Like you start with limited field trials and then try to trials in different sites. And then when you go for commercial approval or when you for large scale cultivation, you also do a couple of other studies like what will be the environmental, not just environment, but also economic cost and benefit. See, one thing which we always assume is that the technology will be economically beneficial and then cost will be much less than the benefits. But it need not be always, because sometimes the cost may be higher and then the benefits may not be commensurate with it. So the regulation will have to also look into what are the potential alternative options available, technologies available, and how do you go about it. In case of gene drives, we know that to eradicate mosquitoes, there have been so many other technologies and many of them have not been successful or have failed or have not been able to continuously work in the field for long term, whether you use insecticides or whether you use sprays or whether you try to eradicate mosquitoes. So if the purpose is to eradicate mosquitoes and if gene drives is going to be the best technology, then we have to really go for it, but with some precautions and then with some specific idea of what will be the consequences of doing it in the short term, medium term, and long term. So this has to be built in the technology evaluation, technology assessment itself. Although I did not discuss today, and then of course we have not discussed that, technology assessment itself is a very big field where there are multiple methods available to assess the impact of a technology, taking into account various factors. And then technology assessment combined with environmental risk assessment can also be really helpful in not only framing regulations, but also in guiding how the way the technology should be developed. And there is one more approach which is also becoming very popular, particularly in Europe. It is called responsible research and innovation, where you actually do a lot of anticipation and then reflect upon the developments. Then there are specific keys on that. One specific key on RRI is public engagement. Other specific key is science, communication science engagement. Then there are ways of, how to conduct responsible research when it comes to gene drives, how to do responsible product development when it comes to gene drive. So these are things where a lot of work is being done, a lot of literature is now emerging. Only thing is that you need to really, keep track of so many developments happening, whether it's gene drives or otherwise. That's a real issue.
And yeah, just to complete, I mean, practically speaking, the labs that develop and work on gene drive developments are regulated, and so they need a particular level of containment, and which is regulated. They need a permit, a research permit to do so. And so you can't just start developing it in any labs. And again, what level of containment will depend on the country where you operate, but also the organism. And so whether for example you operate in a place where the organism could establish outside if it was accidentally released, or whether that organism can survive outside the labs. So that's, for example, for target malaria, the gene drive research is happening in containment level in London and in Italy. And the reason for that is that Anopheles gambiae, the species we work on, is not present locally, and for ecological reason cannot establish. And therefore, in addition to the physical containment measures, you have some ecological containment. So it's quite well established. And in addition to regulations, as Dr. Ravi said, there's also a growing self-regulation from researchers. And interestingly, the field of gene drive has raised a lot of this. A lot of the scientists working on this really want to do it responsibly. So there's quite a lot of literature. I haven't done a compared analysis with other emerging technologies, but I feel there's a lot in this field in terms of biosafety, but also ecological aspects, and talking about my own shop about engagement and how we involve communities into this.
Thank you, Delphine. So I think I'm going to entertain last two questions. Any one of you, Dr. Ravi or Delphine, can answer this. It says here, hello, doctor. My question is, why don't in India we accept genome-edited crops developed by CRISPR, as other countries are accepting it on large scale? Why don't we have such policies and policymakers who can convey to farmers in a better way so that it will be easy for them to accept? Why don't we have discussions and roundtable conference with farmers as well as developers?
Yeah, I will answer it. It is not that India is not permitting genome-edited crops. The thing is that regulations are going to be in place, and recently there has been a relaxation in terms of genome-edited crops, like SDN1 and SDN2. They have given some clarification that there are some relaxations have been done. So soon there will be a policy on genome-edited crops. The constraint here is not the lack of policy or anything. The constraint here is that globally the genome-edited crops are regulated in different ways, and then it is just an emerging regulatory approach in the sense that Europe stays not yet taken a full decision on that. In the sense that the European Commission is trying to push for a liberalized approach, whereas how the countries will take is not very clear. Again, in some countries, they have been totally deregulated. Some countries like Canada and Argentina, they have not totally deregulated, but instead taken an approach that when it comes to novel traits, they should be regulated as GMOs, and then more tests have to be done. So when the regulation itself is globally evolving, India will also do it its own way, but it's taking time. That is inevitable for the simple reason the technology is not that old. To the genome-edited crops, it is not necessary that you should have genome-edited crops for all the crops. The technology should be used only when there is an absolute need to do it, or when you see the specific advantage of using that technology. So which crop should be ideally suitable for genome-edited crops, what sort of traits we should go for, and then what sort of research we should encourage. There are a lot of field experiments that which went on in case of GMOs in India, but they didn't go further for the simple reason there is a moratorium. So in case of genome-edited crops, they're trying to do it in a little more methodical way so that they are relaxing certain things first and then see how it develops and then expand the scope of relaxations and then come up with a full-fledged regime. It is taking time, but it will be soon in place very soon. Thank you.
If I may take a slight step on the side on it, because I don't want to comment on GM crop in India. I'm like really knowledgeless about it, but I wanted to comment some part of the question. I personally think that, and I speak as someone who does a lot of engagement with communities, not with farmers though, but I think we shouldn't see stakeholder engagement or community engagement as something to convince people. I personally think that what we call the deficit model, so the idea that the only reason people don't accept something is because they don't know, is inadequate. I think we can't think like that, and we know this from sadly a lot from the recent vaccine issues around COVID. So during COVID, if you look at how the government dealt with vaccine hesitancy, they were like, let's just throw more information. Let's just say more to people that it's important. And I think in this, we're missing the aspect about what are the issues that people have? What are their concerns? Are we really responding to it? So I don't know if there's, I'm probably the only French here, but I was really appalled, for example, by how my government dealt with it. So the way would be a bit like that. They were like, oh, people don't want to vaccinate, so we're going to tell them how important it is. And they had this clip where there were people asking questions, and the other person would just respond, no, you have to vaccinate. It's going to save your life. Now that's true, but it doesn't address the question. And I think when we want to, and again, I don't know the context in India, but if some people wanted to have that, I think it has to be a discussion about what are people's concerns? Are their response? Have we really proven have we shared the risk assessment if such was done? I think this is important, not to think that people refuse things just because they don't know better or they're not well educated. It has to be a genuine conversation. And I think in what Zahor, if I pronounce that correctly, proposes, I think the idea of roundtable discussions with them, where there's a real discussion and not like one teaching the other, is probably a better way to approach it.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi and Delphine. We are still getting many questions, but unfortunately, we don't have much time left, but hopefully we have addressed some of the important impacts of the economic, social, and health impacts of gene drive today. So may we hear last remarks from Delphine and Dr. Ravi? Ladies first.
Ladies first. Okay.
Yes.
Well, first, I think it's a very important conversation to have and discuss the social, economic, health, human rights impact, because for a long time the discussion has been focused on the environment, and I'm not saying the environmental impacts and risks shouldn't be addressed to the contrary, but I think a lot of concerns from people, and back to this question of, why farmers or others might not want some technology are often rooted in this. What will be the impact on my family, on my livelihood, on my culture, on my decision? And this is really important to tackle. There might be different ways. I personally, I have done impact assessment in the past, mostly looking at livelihood issues and land acquisition issues. And I personally think it's a really strong methodology and has such a strong participation built in that it brings a really interesting additional perspective to the risk assessment. It doesn't replace it. We do need environmental risk assessment, and we need those to integrate better the consultation of the public. But I think the impact assessments really have something really powerful to add to this process.
Thank you, Delphine. So how about you, Dr. Ravi? Please unmute
You're
yourself.
mute.
Unmute yourself, Doc.
See, in case of gene drives, as I said, it's an emerging technology on which we know much, but then we need to really know more. And whether it's public engagement or whether technology assessment or how do we go about environmental regulation gene drive, there is a lot of work that need to be done. Fortunately, there is a lot of good awareness about gene drives, and then there is also engagement initiatives on gene drives. So the literature is growing and the initiatives are going, which is, I think, is good. On the other hand, we need to also be very cautious about gene drives in the sense that we should not end up overestimating it at this stage and then trying to underplay the risks and then say that, okay, we have everything ready, we should be able to do it on a larger scale across the continents, across ecosystems. So an incremental approach, like, taking up these gene drives for mosquitoes and then for other insects, and then trying to see how best it can be applied in other sectors like agriculture will be beneficial. So instead of talking in terms of a gene drive revolution or in terms of a massive expansion of gene drives in the next 5 or 10 years, we should try to incrementally advance our knowledge, advance our risk assessment and methodologies, and also advance the way we want to deal with it, and then see how best we can harness them. Otherwise, we may end up with some unanticipated consequences, which may become a very setback for the technology itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi. And for those who are continually sending questions, maybe you can drop emails, and then ISEA members or the panelists or any of the speakers can answer your questions. Thank you. And before I give the key takeaways for today, let me remind you, please kindly respond to the post-webinar survey and you will get certificate of participation to this webinar. And the link to that post-webinar survey will be posted in the chat box. It's actually already posted. And your responses will really help us to improve future webinars. Now, for the key takeaways for this, from my end, while gene drive technology offers many applications, there is still a need for in-depth and long-term assessment of its potential social, economic, environmental, and health impacts and risk. Take note that gene drives, when released in the environment, may lead to changes that may be irreversible. And then countries, I hope that have to agree on the socioeconomic impact assessment of gene drives, and this decision making must engage all stakeholders and leave no one behind. And the assessment of the socioeconomic, environmental, and health impacts of gene drive organisms have to be case by case, as it will depend on its specific project and context, as comprehensively discussed by Delphine. Any assessment will have to be done in context. What can be the alternative to the use of gene drive and the impacts of that situation? And then the impact assessment must look at impacts of gene drive organisms itself, the protocol, and the intended outcomes. And lastly, the impact assessment for gene drive will complement environmental risk assessment, which is usually done in parallel for different authorities or ministries. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite back Dr. Rodora Romero Aldamita to the stage. Dr. Rodora is the director of the Southeast Asia Center and director of the Global Center on Crop Biotechnology of ISEA. Dr. Rodora, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Grace. I think this is a very good ending to our 3 webinar series. A lot of discussions, a lot of new ideas, and we thank you so much for all the effort that we have, that our panelists gave, Dr. Delphine Tizi and Dr. Ravi, and of course, our very dynamic Dr. Mary Grace Dakuma for moderating this um, whole webinar. The floor was really exciting, and the enthusiasm was felt all throughout the webinar. So GeneDrive research is gaining momentum, as we all know, in many of its many applications in food and agriculture, in human health, and in eradicating invasive species, to name a few. Today's webinar on socioeconomic impact assessment and how this can be conducted in GeneDrive projects is another step towards a thorough understanding of the technology to prepare us in the eventful introduction of the technology and its products. Well, it's still a long way, but we have to prepare. It is crucial to understand the potential social, economic, and health impacts of GeneDrive, as well as its potential risks, to make an informed decision on whether to develop and apply GeneDrive tools. The Outreach Network for GeneDrive Research, the ISA BioTrust, and ISA Inc., which is based in the Philippines, continue to collaborate in providing this science-based understanding of the technology. We will soon publish policy briefs on various aspects of GeneDrive, so better look at our ISA website. And we also have a GeneDrive supplement, which comes every other week together with the Crop Biotech Update newsletter. We invite you to be subscribers of these e-newsletters. So finally, let me remind again all the participants to respond to the webinar survey. We thank the panelists again. Give them a round of applause, a virtual one, if it's okay, for sharing knowledge on risk assessment, and again to Dr. Mary Grace Takuma. And then we thank most especially our attendees for actively participating in this webinar. I would like to remind you again to respond to the webinar survey. And of course, there are questions on the PowerPoint slide. It is available at the ISA website in 1 or 2 days. So please check the ISA website, and it's all there in PDF and also the Zoom recording. So with that, thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone, and see you once again, perhaps next year, as we continue on our advocacy, our information education campaign for GeneDrive and other technologies in biosciences. Thank you so much, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Have a lovely day or evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Zaira, are you staying?
Sure.
Okay.
Doc Ola, pagaling kayo.
Thank you. Halatang halata ba?
No. So pretty. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Neg. See you face to face.
Thank you,
soon.
Grace.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, how many are still there? We reached up to 105. Oh gosh. Where is that? Did you see? 99. I think the person is not there anymore.